Well, our panel includes the former spokesman for the Iraqi government, Ali Dabbagh, the former U.S. military spokesman in Iraq, retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, and a former U.S. diplomat and advisor to the Kurdish Regional Government, Peter Galbraith. But let's first speak to Iraq's former civilian Minister of Defense, Ali Allawi, in London. Ali Allawi, good to talk to you. 15 years on, how will history judge the invasion of Iraq?
Well, it depends who the historian is. I suppose if it was an American, he would say it was one of the greatest disasters of American foreign policy. If it's an Iraqi who has suffered grievously in the former regime of Saddam, it would appear to be a form of liberation, which then descended into chaos and anarchy. And if the writer is a former Arab nationalist or a person who thinks that Iraq has fallen under the sway of alien forces, then he would write it up as or she would write it up as an unmitigated disaster. So it depends who the person who's writing the history.
And how about Ali Allawi? Was the invasion wrong or was the implementation wrong?
No, the invasion was wrong, and I think it's a clear-cut message for the future. I'm afraid that it will probably be repeated, but trying to rely on foreign forces to overthrow a dictatorial regime doesn't necessarily result in the outcomes that people seek. And if you look at the way in which events unfolded after 2003, for the majority, if not the vast majority of Iraq's people, the trade-off was between increased freedoms and living in a Hobbesian world of dog-eat-dog and of extreme violence and mayhem.
15 years on, do you genuinely believe...
Clear.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Do you genuinely believe that you would have been able to overthrow Saddam Hussein by yourselves?
I don't know. I think the mix of the opposition in 2003 was clearly incapable of doing that, because it was handed over a government and a state which it then proceeded to ruin. So the quality of people in the opposition, the mix, their drives and so on would have made it next to impossible.
Dr. Allawi, let me ask you, 15 years on, a lot of people are asking, especially in this age of fake news, with it being a popular term, was the invasion based on a lie?
Yes, I think it was. I mean, obviously, one of the main reason why the invasion took place was supposedly to do with weapons of mass destruction. But the subtext involved many other reasons and causes. But the bill of goods that was sold to the Western public was that it was there to eliminate the weapons of mass destruction, which were a direct threat to the West or to Western civilization. The whole thing was bogus. It was based on far different bases than that, and including revenge, including the national security of Israel, including there are many oil. There are many other factors behind that, but certainly it wasn't anything to do with weapons of mass destruction.
Okay, Ali Allawi, I thank you very much for joining us from London. It's been a pleasure. Let me open this up now to the rest of our panel. Let me ask a man who was the face of the invasion and occupation, a man we saw on our screens in those immediate years afterwards. General Kimmitt, we heard from Ali Allawi that the invasion was based on a lie. Was what you fronted a lie?
Well, no, it wasn't, nor was it bogus, nor was it preposterous. The fact remains that every intelligence service in the world was convinced that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. This was a very short period of time after 9/11 when we had been attacked. America was clearly worried about the national security. We gave Saddam Hussein every chance in the world to demonstrate that he did not have weapons of mass destruction. It was not part of an overall plan to control the Middle East. It was a national security concern based on solid evidence that the intelligence had at that time. Was it an intelligence failure? Yes. Was it bogus? No.
As people look at the historical timeline and they see that initially there were some suggestions that Saddam was connected to 9/11, then that took more of a backseat when there wasn't much evidence. Then it was Saddam has WMDs. They were not found. And then eventually the argument became, well, Saddam's a bad guy. You do understand that as this thing sort of devolved into, well, he's a bad guy and we needed to get rid of him, the credibility of the United States that undertook this venture was severely damaged, wasn't it?
Well, no. First of all, I don't think we went to the war under the proposition that Saddam's a bad guy. We went into the war with our coalition partners, convinced that he had weapons of mass destruction, the capability to deliver them, and in many cases, the willingness. That's what the intelligence said at the time. Was the intelligence wrong? Yes. But you make decisions on the best intelligence you have at the time. And unfortunately, those that think that this was somehow a deep-seated conservative neocon method to come back into the Middle East just don't know the facts,
right.
Certainly don't understand the views that were held at that time.
Okay, so given that you say it was an intelligence failure and a mistake, was then the war a mistake?
The war, we would like to have done it differently, particularly in the post-conflict, post-war period going after June 2004. There's no doubt if we had a chance to do it over again, we would. But life's not about do-overs. You don't get that chance. You might in journalism, but you certainly don't get that in the real world.
Peter Galbraith, was the war worth it?
Oh, well, it depends for whom. For the United States, it was an unmitigated disaster. It's cost at least $2 trillion, maybe $3 trillion. Price tag. We could have provided free health care for every American. It's diminished America's credibility and leadership in the world in terms of the threat of the issue that the war was about, which was not having rogue states threaten the U.S. with WMD. We went after the one so-called rogue state that didn't have it. And the Bush administration then gave a free pass to North Korea, which today may be threatening the United States. And even more fundamentally, I think it undermined the confidence of Americans and people around the world in our institutions. It may have led to the current situation in the United States where we talk about fake news. But now let's look at it from the point of view of Iraqis. From the point of view of Shiites, these are people who have been oppressed brutally by Saddam Hussein. As a result, they were liberated. They were able to vote in free and fair elections, and they voted to install in power Iran's closest allies. The Kurds have always wanted independence. This war has brought them closer to independence than they have ever been. They voted last September, 93% in free elections for independence. There's been a setback since then, but sooner or later, I'm quite confident it will happen. For the Sunnis, some of whom were repressed, this probably was a good thing. For others, it was a disaster. But there's no doubt that the biggest winner in this election, in this war, was Iran, which fought for 8 years in the Iran-Iraq war at a cost of 750,000 lives, a huge treasure to overthrow Saddam and install its allies as the government of Iraq. George Bush did that for them in about 3 weeks. As a result, again, of free elections, the government of Iraq is Iran's closest ally in the world. The other big winner was al-Qaeda and Islamic extremists. They were not present in Iraq, and yet something even worse than al-Qaeda, namely Islamic State, is there. And a year ago, it controlled Iraq's second largest city.
Okay, so let me take one of the things that you mentioned there and pose it to Ali Dabbagh. Ali Dabbagh, is it fair to say that you weren't actually a government spokesman of Iraq? You were a government spokesman of Iraq, which was a vassal state of Iran, actually, over the past 15 years.
The problem, let me just participate in the discussion, that the plan, it was the plan, military plan. It was not a post-war plan by the American. That is the big failure. Now, they fabricate the causes in order to say that Saddam was against the national security of the United States. It is not a military job. It is an intelligent job, which they had fabricated the causes to the administration, and they took the decision of the war. War plan being by the military, but there was only just a war plan.
But it's interesting that you say this as a former spokesman for the Iraqi government, as somebody who benefited from the invasion. You're telling me on this show that the Americans fabricated the fact that Saddam was a threat to the U.S.?
Yes, I mean the intelligence, as Kimmitt said, it was a mistake.
But Kimmitt says it's a mistake.
It was
You're
not
saying
a mistake.
it was a lie, fabricated.
It was a fabricated causes that in order to take the decision of the war.
As a beneficiary of this, don't you feel
Why? Fine.
a bit icky
No,
about
it's okay. No, I mean, we benefit out of we cannot do it, as Ali Allawi said. As an opposition, never, ever we could bring Saddam down. No power on the earth could bring Saddam down, only that the invasion. Invasion was it's a good job to save Iraq, to save Iraqis. But the mistake was no post-war plan. They had dissolved the military without having a proposal, an alternative. And they did a lot of mistake, which again, it makes them pay that they had paid huge casualties, 5,000 soldiers, 50,000 wounded Americans, and finally, Iraq is in the hand of the Iran, as Peter said. It's right, that is true. America, they didn't earn out of that invasion anything.
But let me ask you about your own responsibility rather than the Americans. And I guess the Americans can answer for themselves here. But what about the responsibility of the Shia majority in Iraq, those who benefited from Saddam being toppled? As Peter Galbraith mentioned, we saw Al-Qaeda from among the Sunni fundamentalists. We saw Daesh that emerged, one of the most egregious groups in history. They almost swallowed up most of the country. That's one side to the story. The other side to the story is Shia militias backed by the government, backed by the Iranians as well, right? That wiped out Sunnis, ethnically cleansed many Sunnis. It's well documented. And at the government level, from Nouri al-Maliki, for example, we saw Sunnis being disenfranchised. To what extent is the sectarianism the responsibility of the majority, those people who had the levers of power, never mind the Americans?
Yeah, but you can't blame the Shia. It's part of the Shia, which Maliki.
Right.
Most of the Shia, they were opposing Maliki of what he did
Those
against the
who were
Sunnis,
in power.
or he has been loyal to Iran, or Iran supporting Maliki. You could see that the Grand Ayatollah Sistani was against Maliki, and he had passed the message to Iran not to allow Maliki, not to support Maliki to come for the. You can't blame Shia. But Maliki did a huge mistake, and most of the Shia was against Maliki to have that steps against the Sunnis in Anbar, in Mosul, in many places. So it's not a Shia to be blamed. But Maliki had the big disaster, and the problem and the difficulties, it is in the Shia region. Shia didn't get the services, they are unemployed, and most of the anger and uprising, you could call it, it was in the Shia region, not on the Sunni. You could see for 4 years.
But everything that I told you is factually correct.
Yes.
In the build-up to this, right?
Yes.
What I'm saying is that it can't just be the Americans, right? It has to be Iraqi responsibility as well.
Of course not. Not only on the American, but American at the beginning, at the early stage, they didn't have the plan. They had the decision because they were the invader, and we were under occupation legally. So they had the word.
Right.
By that time, they dissolve everything. The country is in chaos. They allow looting. Many things, I could name it. But at the end, when they had hand over the thing to Iraqis, there was also a big disaster. Maliki, in the 2 terms, had a big mistake, big disasters to the Shia first, to Sunni, to the Kurd, to the country, to the neighbors even. Had spoiled the relation with everybody. And this is, of course, that they are sharing. But at the end, as to look to the history, yes, the invasion, we call it an invasion, not liberation, definitely. The invasion had helped Iraqis in bringing Saddam down and to get the freedom out of Saddam.
So, General Kimmitt, how do you feel about Ali Dabbagh saying this was based on fabrication, it was an invasion, but thanks for toppling Saddam anyway?
Every intelligence service in the world agreed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. Had one of those disagreed and had evidence to dispute that allegation, I'm sure they would have brought it in front of the United Nations. What went in front of the United Nations was a demonstrable case that he did. Again, it was an intelligence failure. There's no doubt about that. It was the predicate for war. There's no doubt about that. It was not fabricated. We don't have the capability in the United States to keep a secret. And if anybody had tried to keep that secret knowing it was bogus information, it would have been announced all over the press. So again, would we have done it this way? Would we have invaded unless there was a solid intelligence case? Probably not. But we cannot continue to wring our hands of the original sin that brought the United States and its coalition partners.
Fair enough. We can't wring our hands about
We've got to move beyond that.
Certainly. We can't wring our hands about the original sin, but these actions had consequences. The UN says about 500,000 dead Iraqis, right? I'm going to forget the UN figure for a moment and take Iraq body count, which is one of the more conservative figures. It says 202,757 dead civilians since the invasion, and total violent deaths 288,000. Very directly, General Kimmitt, was it worth it?
Again, we would have done it differently. You never can assess an operation by the number of civilian or military casualties. That's not a value statement, and try to say it was either worth it or not worth it by the body count. You will never be able to justify a war any time you lose one life. We lost 50 million people on the part of the Soviet Union to destroy the Nazis in Germany. Was it worth it? I don't think those 50 million people would believe that it was.
Okay, Peter Galbraith, is that a satisfactory answer for you?
No. Look, the first victim of propaganda is always the propagandist. And, you know, if you're going to do national security strategy, you have to assess what are your resources, what are your relative threats. Once the inspectors got into Iraq, there was zero chance that Saddam could be developing nuclear weapons, which was the real threat, because you can't hide them. And that was just common sense. And meanwhile, there were two much more serious threats that they chose not to address. Now you can dress it up and justify it and say, you know, the intelligence was wrong. But this wasn't a matter of intelligence. It was a matter of sensible national security strategy. And the results have been catastrophic. I mean, particularly for the United States. The 5,000 dead, you know, and 5,000 dead really understates it, because there are people who are so severely wounded that they aren't going to have a meaningful life, people who would have died in previous wars. And all the Iraqi civilians, again, I think many Iraqis today, again, Shiites and Kurds, might well have judged it worthwhile, but that wasn't a reason for the U.S. to do it. So the costs of this were just huge. The justifications, frankly, ring hollow. I'm convinced that the Bush people believed their own propaganda, but they did not apply rigorous analysis, the kind of analysis that's taught to our military at the National Defense University, where I once taught. That wasn't applied. And then there was a heck of a lot of wishful thinking about remaking Iraq into a Western-style democracy.
Okay, just enough time for two final responses. General Kimmitt, you can respond to Peter Galbraith before I go to Ali Dabbagh. General Kimmitt?
Well, first of all, I won't be lectured by somebody who never wore the uniform. I had to bury some of those soldiers, and it was the most tragic incident of my life. The second thing that I don't want to be, the second thing I don't want to be lectured on is that this war was not worth it, particularly by somebody who has profited immensely by it. So I would simply say that it is tragic. Every time I had to bury a soldier, I cried. Would we have done it differently if we had better information? The answer is yes. Do we like the fact that we invaded, seeing the consequences of what happened in Iraq? No. Do we have to live with those lessons and move forward and try to at least make things better now than they were in 2003? Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask for extra time here because I really need to get two final comments. Now, I said two before, but I want to get Peter Galbraith to respond before Ali Dabbagh. Ali, I'm not ignoring you. I apologize. You are the Iraqi on the panel. Peter Galbraith, you said that was ad hominem. Doesn't Kimmitt make a point? You made, arguably, I don't know, reportedly tens of millions of dollars due to an oil deal with a Norwegian oil company. So maybe he's saying you have a dog in this fight.
Well, if I had a dog in the fight, I might be taking a different point of view. Look, it's always a good thing when you're losing an argument to go to ad hominem comments, and that's exactly what he did. He suggested that since I didn't
Peter,
wear
you're
the
the one
uniform,
that called me a propagandist.
I'm not qualified.
You called me a
to
propagandist. I'm just simply responding to that ad hominem attack.
I have been in war zones. I have negotiated the ends of wars. I saw firsthand the incompetence of General Kimmitt and his planning in Iraq. I was there 6 days after the statue fell. We had no plans to protect any of those buildings except the oil ministry. I mean, it was a...
Peter, at that time, I wasn't even near Iraq, nor was I doing the planning.
your colleagues. But to suggest that because somebody didn't wear a uniform that they can't criticize, that is so antithetical to the nature of our democracy. Of course, it would be a comment that might also apply to any comment made by the current president of the United States.
Okay. I'm going to park that off.
Okay,
Peter, I'm simply saying that those that.
Okay, fair enough. I hope you both consider that satisfactory, that you both got to respond to each other. Ali Dabbagh, I want to talk about a little silver lining for which your government should be congratulated. Mostly defeating Daesh. They're all but defeated in your country. But you couldn't do it without the help of Americans. Yes. So let me pose this to you as the final question. Can Iraq really do anything right now, still 15 years later, anything positive like defeating Daesh without the help of the Americans?
No, never, definitely. Because there was no institution being built correctly in the country during all the period which we had. This is unfortunately to say that. And one of them was military. Military in Mosul, it was a big scandal, what we had in Mosul. And it was a big lie, let me say. It was a military in Mosul. And all of a sudden, that in a few hours, everybody running away, and then they changed their dress.
So you're incapable
Americans,
still.
definitely, they had helped us in getting rid of Saddam. This is, historically, we have to appreciate it, we have to know. But there was no plan. There was no plan post-military, and Americans, they didn't listen to Iraqis on the early stages. Okay, a person like Kimmitt, I do understand that. He's realistic, he's a reliable, he's a good man. Same, many people in the military, but they didn't listen to them. The Americans, they had their own way to do.
But the point I'm making now is that you couldn't defeat Daesh, a group that your soldiers ran away from, without the Americans now.
No, Americans, they had helped us, but the people who had the casualties, who had fight on the ground, was Iraqis, and the Iraqis, they approve. And many people, Americans, they pro-Iraq, and against those against Iraq, they had agreed that Iraqis did the job. But with the help of the Americans, yes, definitely. Because we don't have an air force, proper air force to protect the military, our military, they did a good job. But those who did the job was Iraqis on the ground.
Fair enough. Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately, I have to move on. I would have much preferred to have continued this conversation, but I thank you all sincerely. General Kimmitt, Peter Galbraith, Ali Dabbagh, and earlier Ali Allawi. Thanks for joining us once again on the Newsmakers.